here to start. That's why these things happen. So it's an honor to have Rachel here, and since it's an honor, and we're very happy, very glad of being also this afternoon with you, and we would like to thank each one of you that are logging on to this seminar, that want to grow, want to develop in this such an important area as it is to handle, to manage anger in our children, to get techniques, tips, ideas, advice. So, but before we begin, we need to think in EDUCOM, the different schools, different associated schools that we are developing this program because we want parents to develop more tools to be able to connect to our children better. Before we begin, I would like to ask Carlos from the Grange School to for please introduce our amazing guest from today to Raychelle Lohman. Please, Carlos, how are you? Good afternoon.
Lovely to see you. And we are so privileged tonight to welcome Raychelle Lohman uh, on the topic of helping our children control anger without conflict is the key, isn't it? And Raychelle is a professional counselor, and she is a speaker and an educator and a researcher, and has published several books already. You might have already come across some of her books, such as the Anger Workbook for Teens, the Bullying Workbook for Teens, and the Sexual Trauma Workbook for Teen Girls, books that have been translated in several languages. Raychelle has expertise in a wide range of issues affecting teenagers, adolescents, from anger and aggression to anxiety and depression to sexual abuse and bullying. She also writes the Teen Angst blog for Psychology Today. Raychelle attended North Carolina State University, where she received her BA in psychology, her master's degree in counselor education, and her PhD in counseling and counselor education. Raychelle, who you'll be able to listen to in just a moment, has over 20 years experience in the counseling profession, and she has devoted much of her time to working with children, adolescents, parents, and educators. In other words, most of the people who are here tonight. She's passionate about what she does, and this will show in her presentation, and she strives to live out her personal mission statement, as she stated prior to our talk tonight, of helping others transform their lives from the inside out. Thank you, Raychelle, and we look forward to your talk.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Y antes que comience,
Thank you very much, Carlos. And before Rachel begins, I would like to remind each one of you that in your screen, you have a globe-shaped icon, which is the key for the language that you want to listen to. Now I'm speaking in Spanish, but if you selected English there, the interpreter will translate everything I say simultaneously. And if you selected Spanish, you will hear me directly. And whenever Rachel speaks, you will be able to hear her translated, interpreted actually in by the people that are doing this possible, making this possible. But and lastly, I would like to remind you that if you have any questions, that go ahead, post them in the chat, because after that we will have room where Rachel will be able to answer each one of our questions. So I would like to remind you, we will leave a message in the chat box to explain everything again for those that join later. But remember that in the globe icon, you can select whether you would like to hear this in Spanish or English. Now, Rachel, let's go with you.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Carlos. I am excited to be with you this evening to talk about a topic I'm very passionate about and have spent a lot of my personal career devoted to helping educators, parents, and children who struggle with anger and aggression. So tonight I want to speak with you about what anger and aggression are, what those look like, how it can become problematic. So you can even look at some of the signs and symptoms that may be present in your own home or that you may be struggling with your own child with, as well as give you some helpful evidence-based tips based on research that has shown effectiveness in working with these children who display anger and aggression. I think one of the main things in that fabulous introduction of me was that wasn't mentioned is I'm a parent and I currently have raised a teen and I have one residing in my home. So as a parent, I also understand those firsthand challenges that you may face in your own homes and those struggles. And it's really our work with our educators to teach our kids to be able to communicate effectively, to be able to express their emotions without aggression so their voices can be heard. So I hope through tonight's presentation, I'll also convey those messages that anger is not a unhealthy emotion. It's what we do with our anger that can make it problematic. Um, I think it's also fair to say that I understand anger firsthand because I was one of those angry teens that I write about. And I still have proof on my childhood bedroom door when I go back to visit my parents of where my own anger got out of control. And I had picked up a book off of my dresser and I threw it at the door and knocked a hole in the door. And I wish I could go back and talk to that angry young lady with all of the knowledge that I have now. But what I've decided to do instead is something that I can do, which is move in a forward motion and help children express their anger more effectively. I remember the book to this day that I threw at the door. I remember being angry, but I cannot tell you what made me so mad at that particular time in my life. So as I've continued my career, I've worked in schools for over 20 years as a school counselor. I am a private clinician. Actually, prior to doing the presentation tonight, I spent time with a client, a young client that struggles with anger. So this is something that I have carried forth in my career to work with these children, these teens, and help them be able to use their voice and express their anger and realize what to do with all of that energy whenever they feel it bubbling up within them. So without further ado, I just wanted to share with you briefly what I'm going to cover tonight. I'm talking about what anger and aggression are, because sometimes we display those or we discuss those in the same format. We use them synonymously, but they're not the same thing. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding of that. And then I've got a little questionnaire I'll walk you through to help you see how problematic is your child's anger and what causes anger. What are the things that trigger our anger? And furthermore, what are the signs and the symptoms? So I'm just not going to give you just a list of signs and symptoms, but I want you to see how anger can transform across the physical dimension, our feelings, our emotional, as well as our thoughts, how it affects our thoughts. And then, of course, end with some of those helpful strategies and then open the floor for questions that you can ask specifically. So let's begin with discussing what anger is and what anger is not. Anger is an emotion. It runs the gamut along with joy and sadness and fear and disgust. It is one of our basic emotions that is universal, that we all understand what it feels like to be angry. It varies in intensity, and we use various words to show that we're getting angry. We could say anything from rage to hostility, which would be on the high end of the spectrum of anger, Or we could say we're frustrated, we're irritated, and that would be lower on the spectrum. And that's where we want to teach our children to begin to identify when they're low on that anger spectrum, so they don't get all the way up to that hostility and that rage that they may feel. Because when they've gone that far up the ladder, it's harder to get them back down. And we'll talk about that from a neurobiological process in tonight's presentation. But here's a myth with anger. Anger is often attributed, and I've seen it a lot in the literature, referred to as this negative emotion. And I am here to tell you that it is by no means a negative emotion. It is one of our primary emotions that spawns us into action when we feel we've been wronged, when we feel that justice needs to be served. And anger throughout the history of time and throughout the world has been shown to be very effective when we look at social justice that needs to go on, when we see people that are taking a strong stance for something that they don't feel is right. And in those situations, that voice of anger is being used appropriately, and it's creating action, change, from laws to policies that we can carry forth to make the world a better place. So anger is not a negative emotion. However, the problem lies in what we do with that anger. And the same is true with our kids. What are they doing with their anger? How are they behaving? So it's the behavior that we'll focus on tonight. There's also some different types of anger. Now, external is the type that we are probably all familiar with as parents. That is where our kids may throw a temper tantrum. They might break things, use, especially as teens, they may use some explicitive language, a colorful vocabulary. They may shout to try to get their feelings out. That's a common form when we think of anger. You know, we think of that face of the anger expression and someone lashing out. However, there's a silent component to anger, and that's the internal process of anger. Internal is, if we think of it like external is what bubbles above the surface, internal is what is brewing below the surface. Internal is a self-directed anger. And oftentimes we might see this with children who have depressive symptoms, who are struggling with depression. They have, if you want to see, you know, if you think your kid's struggling with anger, you can also listen to how they talk about themselves. They might have feelings of low self-worth or not believing, we call it self-efficacy, not believing in their ability to achieve things. They may say things like, I'm stupid, no one likes me, I can't do anything right. It's a lot of what we call unhealthy self-talk and self-sabotaging behaviors. And some of these kids also, because they don't know what to do with that anger that is just brewing below that surface, sometimes they'll act out behaviorally in the form of self-harm. So the self-directed anger, that internal anger, that's one that doesn't show us on the surface like the external. And we might not realize that our child is really struggling with anger and lacking the ability to communicate it unless we start looking for some of these signs. There's also the passive anger, and that anger comes out behaviorally as far as kids that'll give you the silent treatment. You know, when in my own home, I have a teenage daughter, and when I do something that she doesn't like, you know, she just cuts me off with her words. She won't say anything to me. It's like I don't even exist sometimes. So I have that passive anger in my own house. They also might use sarcasm, snarky little snide remarks back at you when you irritate them, and that's more of the passive. So again, external is what we typically see. That's what we think of when we think of anger. But I also wanted to highlight things that are showing in the research between the internal and the passive anger as well. Next is aggression. Now, we said anger is not an unhealthy emotion. It's quite healthy if used appropriately. When coupled with its cousin, aggression, it is harmful. Aggression, by definition, is the intent to do harm. We can see aggression come out through verbal behaviors, that lashing out. We can also see it come out physically, and those are outward displays of aggression. That's what we call reactive aggression when we get angry. And then there's also passive aggression. It's important to understand that aggression, again, is an intent to do harm, and it is not helpful in any way when coupled with anger. However, we don't have to be angry to be aggressive. As a matter of fact, many people get angry and they don't act out with aggression. So where anger is an emotion, aggression is a behavior. And we also don't have to be aggressive to be when we're angry. We can display aggression when we're not angry. For example, let's say someone's done your child wrong and they've kind of held that grudge in the back of their mind, and now it's time to get back at them, but they're not angry about what happened anymore. They just need a little bit of retribution. This is passive aggression, which is what I'm referring to right now. And then they go back and they get back at the kid. They're not angry at the time that they did it. So there's two types of aggression that we're seeing a lot in the literature and what I've focused my own research on, and that's proactive aggression. Again, it's a quieter type of aggression. It's a manipulative type of aggression. And it also could be, for example, hitting up here, but you're not angry. You just might want to get respect for everyone to know not to mess with you as a kid, or even bullying can fall into proactive aggression. Reactive aggression, kind of like external anger, that's what we see a lot of, is that reactive aggression. That's that defensive, that impulsive. Someone makes the kid mad or your child mad and they just react. So we're most commonly we see reactive aggression, or when we think of aggression, we think of that verbal lashing out, or we think about physical aggression. But there's the other side to aggression that I also wanted to point out. So I wanted to run a few questions by you. So what I'd like for you to do is get something to write with, and you can either just put a little check for each of the 12 questions that I am going to read to you about anger. And if your child fits into one of these categories, just put a little check on your piece of paper. So question number 1, my child is unable to manage impulses and urges without adult help. Question number 2, my child has frequent anger outbursts, even over minor issues. Question number 3, my child has frequent anger outbursts. Oh, excuse me. Question number 3, my child turns their anger into a tantrum through shouting, kicking, swearing, even spitting, fighting. You might see that in younger behaviors. The next question, my child is frequently disciplined for anger issues. How much grounding and disciplinary measures are you having to take with your kid? The next question, my child has difficulty bouncing back from a frustrating situation. You know, those kids that kind of hold on to it and seethe. They don't let it go. The next question is, my child frequently gets into fights. The next one is, my child frequently gets into trouble at school or other social settings. The next question is, your child frequently loses friends due to their anger. My child is described by adults as having anger issues. Like, how do other people talk about your child? Or has the teachers or administrators ever brought up that your child needs to learn to calm their temper? These also may be, some of these questions may be a continual theme throughout your child's life, especially if they've struggled with anger. The next question, my child behaves recklessly when they're angry, and their anger poses a safety issue. So we're talking about that impulsive anger, that external and reactive aggression. The next question, my child is often sullen, silent, and holds in their anger. Again, that internal anger that's bubbling and brewing below the surface. And the last question is, or statement, excuse me, is my child verbalized, writes about, or draws pictures of violent and aggressive acts? So this could come out particularly in writing prompts at school or in art class, or even if they're doodling on their papers, you might see pictures with swords or weapons. You might see some writing about wanting to hurt or harm other things or destroy property. So with those 12 questions, just add up all of your checks and just take a look at those. Now here's the trick. I've not got an answer to what's gonna is high on the scale. But this is a good, what I call baseline assessment to see where your child is with some of these questions. Because if you answered more than 50% of these questions, then it's obviously that anger is impairing, excuse me, anger is impairing your child's life in some way, what we call as clinicians their functionality. And that could come across at school if it's impairing their academic performance or their social interactions at school. It could be impacting their relationships with you and their siblings at home. If they're working, it could impact the relationships with other employers, or it could keep them from engaging in activities, extracurricular activities, because they don't know how to control themselves. They don't have that emotional regulation aspect to their emotions. So hopefully you'll learn some tips, but if you are struggling and are meeting many of those checks, I hope you will reach out to either your educators at your schools for assistance or get professional help that can help one-on-one with your child so they can learn what to do with that anger. Because what we know about high levels of anger, especially when coupled with aggression, if we don't teach our children how to process what they're feeling, then it will affect them later in life. It will affect their relationships with other people. And more importantly, it will affect their health. There has been multiple studies that have shown high correlations of anger with cardiovascular disease, early onset of stroke, hypertension, obesity. So anger, if not taught how to cope with early in life, can be extremely problematic and impact your child's health in the future, as well as their relationships with others. So let's talk about what causes anger. And to be honest, there are multiple things that cause anger. But one of the key things we want to look for is that information that you just gathered in answering that questionnaire gives you a baseline for your children. I want you to think about your teen and what triggers their anger. Actually, I'll go a little aside here. I want you to write down just like 2 or 3 things that you think irritate or really trigger your child's anger. Give you a second or two to do that. What makes them mad? And just for the fun of it, not that you're going to be sharing this, but put a couple of things to the side that triggers your own anger. For example, if your child talks back to you, is that an anger trigger for you? Is that something that irritates you? Or if you're on a busy highway running late to something, is that something that triggers your frustration? What triggers your anger? Well, here are some of the top reasons that children say they get angry. One, they don't feel that people are listening to them. They feel misunderstood, that they're not able to express what they're feeling and articulate that. They're hungry or they're tired. Come on, parents, you know what I mean here when you're dealing with either a hungry teen or a teen that hasn't had enough sleep. And by the way, worldwide, we're seeing that many of our kids are lacking sleep. So, just making sure that they get that recommended amount of sleep, which for adolescents, an adolescent stage of development, they're needing about 8.5 to 9 hours of sleep each night. And quite frankly, many of them are not even getting close to that. When they don't get what they want, I know that's no surprise that when your kid doesn't get what they want out of something, that triggers their anger. The client that I met with earlier this evening, this was the big trigger that we focused on in our session, is when he gets stressed, it is a trigger for him. And he gets really angry because he doesn't know what to do with that feeling of feeling anxious or stressed. And sometimes that stress can come from academics. So if they don't feel they're doing well in a subject and you're questioning, what's your grade in this class? Why are you missing homework? Then they get really stressed. They don't know what to do with that and they may lash out. Again, it's that inability to communicate. If they feel embarrassed, that is one thing that children don't like to feel like they're put on the spot or they're embarrassed, especially children who have what I call short fuses. If they get embarrassed, it's not uncommon for those kids to lash out. So if you're an educator and you're teaching them and they're struggling to grasp onto a concept, and all of a sudden you call them out to ask them to share something in class and that embarrasses them, they might come back with a quick comeback or something, a sign of disrespect to the teacher, but it might all be because they felt embarrassed because they're confused and they don't know the answer and they don't want to look like they don't know the answer. Here's a big one for teens. When they think something's not fair, they like to take it upon themselves and get action and justice. And sometimes that justice might not be rightfully served, or they might not be using their voices appropriately, or they might resort to violence to try to get that justice. But they may have a good point about what they're angry about if something's not fair. So we've got to teach them to channel that in appropriate ways and use their voices. So if they think something's not fair at school versus getting really loud and belligerent, talk to the administrator, talk to the head of the school, get a petition. There's proper ways that we could use our voice, and we want to teach our children to be autonomous. We want to teach them to be responsible and to take things, because they are our next generations. They're leading us forward into the future. So teaching them to use their voices appropriately is key. If they feel hurt, oftentimes a sense of pride, they don't want to state that their feelings are hurt. So it's easier to act out in anger. Anger is actually called a surface emotion because it's believed that it hides and conceals other emotions such as guilt, hurt, shame, embarrassment, anxiety. If they're overstimulated or overwhelmed, again, that can tie back to stress where they have a lot on their plate. They don't know how to process it. They don't know how to organize it. And if they have difficulty expressing how they feel, even in my private practice, I work with professional adults who have a very difficult time using words to convey their feelings. Because at some point in time, they were taught that it wasn't okay to do that, that they needed to repress what they were feeling. And it has caused problems into their adulthood life with relationships, because when things get really bad, they don't communicate what they need to their partner. So it's so important if we could really look at that last bullet point and make sure that we're teaching our children how to use words to express and communicate how they feel, so they don't bottle it up and so they don't carry it with them into their future and to the relationships with their own partners or with their own children. If I could ask you to remember anything from
Si pudiera
tonight's
pedirles que se llevaran
If I could ask you to remember anything from tonight's presentation, it would be this: all behavior serves a purpose. Behavior is a form of communication. And perception is reality. Now, what do I mean by all of that? Basically, if your child is struggling with anger, know that the way they are acting when they're angry is serving a purpose. They're having a need met, right or wrong, a need's being met. That's why they keep resorting to that behavior. When we figure out the purpose behind the behavior, then we can begin the foundational work to help them work through that anger. So finding out the purpose, and it is hard, I will tell you, even as a clinician, because anger is a chameleon of all emotions and it likes to camouflage. And children aren't so, neither are adults for that matter, they're not so freely giving of information. Sometimes they don't even know what the purpose is. But as parents, watch your child, really pay attention, observe what their triggers are that we talked about, what it is that is driving their behavior. And I'll be honest, I've worked with some teens and the purpose is to wear the parent down to get what they want. I've even seen it in the school system too. It's to exhaust because they have learned by a process of positive reinforcement throughout their life that they can just wear you out and then eventually you don't have any more, like there's no more fight in you to give to whatever the topic is. And then I've seen so many parents go, fine, whatever. That's not what you want to do, because for this particular child, they're going to keep on going and it's not going to stop until they learn that that behavior is no longer serving the purpose that they want. Let's talk a little bit about the brain. The amygdala. There's two parts of the amygdala. Now I can't even talk. The amygdala and the brain. And what it is it's a collection of cells right there at the stem of the brain. And during the adolescent years, it's really like our alarm system, if you will. We, as adults, it activates our fight or flight system, and it does that for kids too. What is fight or flight system? That's a stress response. It tells us we're in danger, and our body starts to react. The amygdala rings the alarm and sends messages to the frontal lobes up there of the brain, which then tries to decide, are we really in danger? What do we need to do? Do we need to just freeze? Do we need to fight? Are we in physical danger? Or do we need to run from the situation? So all of that is going on when we're angry. As adults, that prefrontal cortex kind of takes over the fire alarm and starts thinking through and processing information differently. As kids, the amygdala keeps ringing the fire alarm because that prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until around the age of 25. So when we think about what's going on in our angry teen's brain, that amygdala just is constantly ringing the fire alarm. So the thought process, that higher executive functioning that needs to be going on to determine and make proper decisions, isn't able to do that. So for example, let's play this out in real life. You're having an argument with your teen. They have really dug their heels in and you are not going to give in. And they are beginning to walk away from you. They're telling you, just give me some space. And you're not going to give them any space because that's a sign of disrespect. They're walking away from you. And so you try to start reasoning with them. All they're hearing is the fire alarm in their head going off. They cannot reason with you because their fight or flight is being activated constantly. And the part of their brain that does that rationalization, that information isn't making it from the amygdala up there to the part of that brain. Daniel Goleman actually wrote about this and he called it the amygdala hijack. And that's really what happens is the amygdala hijacks that prefrontal cortex part of your brain. So all that to say is you're not going to rationalize with an angry person. And that's why there is really a neurobiological component at work. So the best thing you can do whenever you're working with your angry teen or an angry person in general, it doesn't matter how old they are, is to let them calm down before you begin to reason with them. In the school setting, if we had fights in school, it wasn't uncommon for me to see heads of schools pull students in right away and try to get statements and understand from the student's perspective what's going on. It's the worst thing they could have done, because at that very moment, the students are still in that fight or flight mode, and then they start rehashing everything that made them mad. Like the fire alarm is still going off inside their brain. We need for that to silence. We need to calm them down before we can work with them. So I'm not saying don't give consequences as a parent, and schools shouldn't give consequences. I'm just saying the best time to do that is whenever we have them in a calm state, because then the prefrontal cortex is back at work doing what it's supposed to do, which is help them regulate emotions, think through and process decision making. So let's talk about a few signs and symptoms of anger. And I wanted to really break it into three parts because anger has a physical part, a biological part to it. It has an affective part, which we call the emotional part, and then it has a behavioral part. That's the actions. That's what we do when we're angry. So from a physical perspective, because when our bodies go into that fight or flight mode, that stress response, we automatically start preparing to protect ourselves. Our muscles tighten, jaws may clench, our eyes, actually your vision becomes sharper when you're in fight or flight because you're scoping out the situation. Your hearing becomes keener. And so you're really zeroing in on the environment. All this is going on whenever you're in fight or flight. Adrenaline and cortisol are being released into the bloodstream. So there's a lot that's happening. So it's no wonder whenever people start to come down when they've been at a very heightened sense of anger, to have these headaches because of all that tension that's going on in the body. It's also not uncommon to have gastrointestinal problems, stomach problems with anger, rapid heartbeat, because again, your body's getting ready to run, fight, protect itself, whether it realizes it's in danger or not. Coincidentally, if you have a teen who worries a lot or struggles with anxiety, this same stress response, the fight or flight stress response, also is present with children who are anxious. The only thing is it doesn't get turned off. It's constantly on because they feel a sense of danger and worry in their life. So just to put that in perspective for children who really struggle with anxiety, to constantly be on alert like that is very stressful and healthy for them. So we have to teach them skills to be able to flip the switch off so they realize that not everything is an emergency that they need to react to or feel that they need to react to. Emotional, we might see depression from that affective component. We might see if they feel stressed, they're overwhelmed, a sense of shame. It's not uncommon. And think about this in your own home too. If you have a child that gets out of control with anger, do they come back later after they've calmed down and experienced this remorse? Do they apologize for their behavior? That's not uncommon. If they feel, now some kids stick their heels in and they think they're wrong and that you're wrong, they're right, they're not going to apologize. But there are those kids, such as myself as a teen, feeling really bad once that book hit the door and I calmed down. So that's not uncommon. And those are the kids that really want our help. You know, our kids are really not wanting, they don't like their behaviors. They realize they're out of control. And then behaviorally, you can see a whole host of things. Also not uncommon to see physically. I've even seen kids break out like in a rash from their chest all the way up their neck when they're really upset about something. We've talked about some symptoms, but I also need to bring to note that anger is a symptom of some more severe mental health issues or diagnoses. And I want to bring up some of those that are the most common in children. But before we do that, this is from the World Health Organization. And unfortunately, we are beginning to get more data points in on children during COVID globally. And we're really beginning to see the impact that this pandemic has had on not only adult mental health, but also youth mental health, particularly in the times of quarantine. And we also need to remember that it's at this point in time in their lives that social skills and developing that autonomy and pull away from the parents and, who they are as a person and being able to think analytically on their own. This is the time of development that's occurring. And whenever they were in quarantine or they weren't able to have those socializations with their peers, they missed some pivotal moments. So according to the World Health Organization, we've got about 1 in 6 of our kids worldwide, ages 10 to 19, that struggle with a mental health illness. They account for 16% of all disease and injury in this population. 80% are undetected or untreated, and that could be, I know in the US, we struggle with a lot of stigmatization that surrounds mental health. It's not commonly talked about, so we're really trying to encourage people to talk more about their mental well-being because we're seeing the impact of what our mental well-being really does for us. And we can even look at us being quarantined or during this pandemic, how that affected us. Depression is one of the leading causes of illnesses worldwide, and and that the last one's really the sad one when I think about it. It's the 4th leading cause of death for 15 to 19-year-olds. So we've really got to do a better job globally helping our kids cope with life stress and getting them the help when they need it. So when we look at things that anger can be a symptom of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and this often begins to manifest early in childhood. But we can see that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, the kids are more impulsive and reactionary. So it's not uncommon if they don't think something's fair, just to lash out or let you know immediately. Anxiety, which typically we start to see that manifest in the teenage years more. And anxiety is one that kids don't know what to do. As I gave you the example of my own client that I'm working with that's highly stressed, they don't know what to do with that feeling that's just eating away at them, and they don't know how to express it and communicate it. Depression, oftentimes when people think about depression, they think about feelings of sadness, hopelessness, isolation. But we know in adolescence, symptoms can be different from that of adults. As a matter of fact, one of the top symptoms of clinical depression in children is anger. So, watching and again, listening for the words that your child uses to describe themselves as far as low self-worth, not feeling good about themselves. And then if they're just lashing out on every little thing, like there's not something that is sparking that anger, that's a sign something deeper may be going on, especially if you see changes in their hygiene. If you see that their friendship groups changed, or maybe they're isolating themselves in their bedroom more, they're not sleeping as much, they're eating too much, they're not eating enough, all flags for depression. If they have a learning disorder, and we see this in school, and oftentimes these are detected in those earlier years of school, but sometimes they make it to the upper grade levels and they struggle with the learning disorder, and it fell through the cracks. It wasn't caught. So if they're struggling with math and they're going to mathematics every single day, and they're not able to express, they don't feel smart, this is something that could irritate. This can be very frustrating to them. And we can even see they don't want to go to school anymore, or they have chronic absenteeism because of that. Sensory processing issues is another one. These are kids that are sensitive to sounds and their environmental changes, which also ties into autism spectrum disorder. Oftentimes, many of the children that fall on the spectrum for autism struggle with sensory processing. So these are just some things that I call beyond anger. We get into the clinical realm of what's going on with children. And this would require you talking to your educators or getting more assistance professionally from clinicians in your community, or even talking to your child's doctor. I just wanted to share a couple of quick things about anxiety. Typical warning signs if you have a teen that struggles with anxiety is they're going to avoid, and a lot of this is going to look similar to depression. I do want to mention that. And depression and anxiety are often what we call comorbid. They go hand in hand with one another. But we'll see an avoidance of activities that they like, that maybe they like to do, or maybe they really love drama. And there's a big school production that's coming out, but they won't try out for it because of anxiety. They're worried more about what's going to happen. These are your what if kids. What if this? What if that? And it hinders them from really trying things outside of their comfort zone. That worry is chronic. It interferes with what we call their daily functioning. That's that functionality I was talking about clinically. We look to see, is this impairing their performance in other areas? Is it affecting them on a normal daily basis? They have trouble sleeping, and it's not uncommon if you're working with a younger child with anxiety that you'll see that they still sleep with the parents for that sense of security. Psychosomatic conditions, that gets into those headaches we were talking about. This is the mind and the body interaction. The headaches that we were talking about, the rashes, the stomach aches is very common. The butterflies with the knots in the stomach with anxiety. Just a couple of things if you're working with an anxious kid. One thing you might not want to say is stop worrying so much. Trust me, kids who struggle with anxiety, if they could stop all that's going on in their mind and not worry about it, they would do anything to do that. Rather, open up the door for communication. Ask them what you can do to help. If they're struggling to get ready for school because they have maybe some school anxiety, instead of saying, hurry up, you're going to be late, that's only going to intensify that anxiety. What can I do to help you? And you'll be surprised. They'll come up with things like, could you pack my lunch? Could you do this? Could you do that? We need to offer, like, we recognize the anxiety is present, but just a couple of strategies and things that you can say along the way to help your kid. Definitely not you're making a big deal out of nothing. Acknowledge their feeling. Be affirmative in what they're feeling. Let them know, validate it. Validate, I see this is upsetting you. We'll figure this out together. Depression, again, you're going to see a lot of commonality with depression and anxiety. They may have difficulty concentrating, focusing, again, changes in hygiene, changes in sleep. All of this clinically needs to go on for we'll see it go on for 6 months, and it really affects who they are. They may become more aggressive, agitated, and angry. When a child's suffering with depression, because they can come at you with a lot of anger, and I know as parents, sometimes it's hard not to react whenever your child's coming at you disrespectfully. It's important that we separate the behavior from our child, that we stop, we listen, and we give them time to collect themselves. It's also okay to take the conversation to difficult places, even if we don't want to ask our own child if they've had thoughts of hurting or harming themselves, because we might not want to know the answer to that. But we just saw this is the 4th leading cause of death of youth in the world is suicide. So go ahead, take that conversation to difficult places. Get them to be able to open up and let them know that you are a safe person. I mean, as a parent, you're what they've got. You are their number one role model. And research time and time again has shown us that even if they're rolling their eyes when you're talking to them, they're listening to you. They're watching you and your behavior. Spend some time with them. Teens, they may want to push you away, but they also want to hold you close. So find things, a commonality, or even if you have to go to one of their concerts, hopefully we'll be back to those stages post COVID again. But just spending some quality time doing something, or even if it's something in the kitchen, cooking a family meal with one another. And then if it's something that concerns you, again, please seek professional help if you're seeing some signs for clinical depression. All right. So the top contenders here as we are going, wrapping up this evening's presentation is stay calm and be consistent. When your child is angry, again, I want you to think about that amygdala hijack. Give them space. Let them go to their room. Encourage them to go outside and get some fresh air. There is power in that. And then whenever you get ready to deal with the behavior after they've calmed down, be consistent in your approach. I can tell you, teens are very smart. And if there is a loophole or a way that they can manipulate a situation to get what they want, it is not uncommon for them to do so. So that's why consistency is very important. And that's the number one thing that parents struggle with, that I've seen in private practice, that I've seen in giving speeches to multiple populations, is they struggle with that consistency. Again, especially if you have a child that is going to wear you down, dig their heels in, and just get you to give up, give them what they want. Those are probably the most difficult to be consistent with. There's that proverb, patience is a virtue. And if you're raising a teen, that is absolutely true. But again, we want our teens to be able to express their thoughts, their feelings, and not to be so reliant on us whenever they leave our homes. We want to be their coach and friend as they grow older. Now we are their coach. We are encouraging them. We take different roles as parents as our kids get older. And, when they're young, we're really guiding them, we're directing them, we're giving them a lot of advice. And then when they get to those teenage years, we begin to move to the sidelines, although we can still run out on the field if we need to. But when they become adults, we do want them to see us as someone that they can come to, but not necessarily going to have the ability to solve their adult problems when they get older. So just encouraging them to be able to use those words, and that we can be calm and consistent and present with them. Speaking of words, let's choose our words wisely when we're talking to the teen. Again, it goes back to understanding when they're calm, instead of saying when they're really angry, how are you feeling? As we've talked about, a lot of teens don't know how to express what they're feeling. So rather just ask them something like, you seem really worked up. Let me help you calm down. I'm sorry you're so upset right now. Why don't you go out, get some fresh air, and let's talk about this. Letting them know that you see they're upset, but not engaging in that conversation when they are angry. I had you write your triggers down and your kids' triggers. Go back and look at what you wrote down towards the beginning of the conversation for your kids, and avoid those. Those are things that you don't want to intentionally set off with your child whenever they're angry. So avoid those triggering events. But more importantly, we want to teach them to understand what their triggering events are, because when you're aware of what a triggering event is, you can avoid it possibly, or just being cognizant, knowing that this is a situation I tend to get upset when I'm in. just knowing that and having the power to have this internal dialogue with yourself, like, okay, I know this really is upsetting me. I need to take deep breaths. I need to work through this is really important. So knowing your triggers and having your, ask your teen. I gave you 10 at the beginning of the presentation, but if you don't know what your teen's triggers are, ask them, what is it that really irritates them that others do? They'll they'll probably tell you quite a few. Or if you're up for it, you can ask them what you do that irritates them, and that'll be a couple of triggers too. And then maybe you can start a dialogue and tell them what they do that triggers you. Some of the key signs to watch for changes in mood and demeanor of your teen. This is particularly if they're going up that anger scale or escalating. Um, they may move around more. They may flail their arms, use body language more, talk at a faster pace, change their tone of voice. It might come deeper and more gravelly when they talk, and have that uncontrollable body language. So just key signs to watch out for, and you'll know that they're climbing that anger scale. One of the fundamental things, I call this back to basics, that we need to make sure that gives us the foundation for helping our teens is making sure they're eating healthy. When we put fuel in our vehicles, if we put poor fuel in our vehicles or bad fuel, it's not going to run as efficiently as if we put good fuel in our vehicles. So the same is true with the body, just focusing on what nutrients we're putting into our body, making sure that our teens are getting enough sleep. And as humans, we're meant to move. So making sure that they are moving, they're growing, they're changing, their bodies are developing. They need to be exercising and moving around. There's actually, with depression, there's been studies that have shown that these three elements can be as effective as medication in treating depression. So this really is the basics of our survival that we need to be mindful of. We've already spoken about providing space and making sure that our teens have space to calm down. And that might be wherever that is, their room, outside, wherever that may be, just giving them that space, because you're going to be more effective in reaching them and teaching them and coaching them when they are in a calmer state of mind. So you can create those outlets for them. Outlets are also important. I oftentimes look at how kids release their anger. Some are physical. We've talked about that. And I've had parents purchase heavy bags to put in the garage or in a room of the house, so their kid can actually hit that and work out their anger. Some kids might want to run. They might want to pound it out on the pavement. Some kids may want to play soccer. They may want to play basketball. Whatever it is, if you have a physical kid, the worst thing you can do is have them sit down when they're angry. They need to move. So it's really important that we're attuned to what our children need. So don't follow them around, as we've already discussed. You can discuss the consequences later. You'll get further if you wait till they've calmed down. To help them calm down, there are some strategies, and I know we just have a few more minutes of tonight's presentation, but I think this is one strategy that we take for granted, and it is the power of breathing. And I'm going to show you. I have my breathing ball that I've got, and I work with this with clients and teach them how to breathe. Adolescents love it. It's colorful. Children love it. Adults love it. But basically, I pull it all the way out. This is called a meditational deep breathing ball. You can usually find it in toy sections. And then we breathe in. We breathe out, and we breathe in. So this is a great way that even in practice, I'll recommend this as homework, and my clients will get this, and we practice breathing, because deep abdominal breathing actually releases oxygen into the bloodstream, and it helps us think clearly. It actually calms us down. So teaching our children to take those deep abdominal breaths. Another thing you can do is teach them to do what we call mental imagery. is to visualize someplace calming. So I did this with an anxious client last week in a session. Adolescent came in really worked up, really rough day at school. And I said, okay, stop. Let's take some deep breaths. And I modeled that. I said, close your eyes. I'll close my eyes too, or take just a few deep breaths. And I said, don't open your eyes, but I just want you to go anywhere in the world that you want to go to. And just picture yourself being there. What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you see? And then I ended it with a few more breaths, had the teen open her eyes. And the first thing she said to me was, that was really relaxing. I said, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being that you were just totally chill out whenever you came in here, very relaxed, to 10, meaning you were on edge. Where were you when you came in? She said, I was probably like an 8 or 9. I'm like, okay, well, where are you now after we've done this exercise? She goes, I'm like at a 3 or 4. So just the power of 2 minutes of helping her work herself back down. So then we could get further in the session versus if she just sat down and like, well, tell me what happened during your day, because we would have stayed up there at that high level. So I love the power of scaling. Teaching them to live in the moment. I did that at that point in time with that client because I had her tap into her senses. What do you hear? What do you see? Describe to me where you're at. Another one, and we've talked about this, is get moving, especially if you have an angry child that likes to move and needs to move. The scaling, again, is the scales. You can do it various ways. I usually do 1 minimum with 10 maximum. And teens are really good at reporting that. And you can ask them when they're upset on any emotion where they are on the scale. And it gives you a good baseline for how they're feeling. And then you can go back and ask them later and see if they've come down. Now, in a session when I'm working with a client that's a 9, an 8 or a 9, or even a 10, I'm a miracle worker if they leave me at a 1. They don't. But if I can get them down to even a 5 or a 6, if they're at a level 10, then we have made progress and they're feeling better. So just, figuring out what took them down the scale. So some of the key takeaways is 1, don't give in. I'm not telling you to give in. I'm just helping you understand your child and know when to talk to them at the best time. Praise good choices. Our adolescents, our teens need to hear positive reinforcements. We have some amazing teens in this world. Sometimes I'll just sit here and Google stories around the world that teens are doing, what the innovation, the things that they're coming up with. It's just amazing to me that, worldwide, sometimes we don't give our teens enough credit, but we have this amazing generation that we're raising right now. And all of us take a part in that. Also help them practice problem solving skills. They're going to carry that into the future. And don't give up on your kid. Don't give up on them. Even when they've pushed every button, they have the detonator in hand for you and you're about ready just to say, I can't take it anymore. They need you. Because you're the most influential person in their life. And that concludes tonight's presentation. I hope that you're able to walk away with some strategies, some tips to help with your own team and improve your relationship.
Muchas gracias, Rachel,
Thank you very much, Raychelle, for your presentation. Now we will start with the Q&A session. I can see that there's a few of them in the chat, and I will ask John to take the role of the moderator so then he can take the questions from the audience, from each one of you, to ask Rachel about this question. So we would like to invite everyone to ask away, and we can grow in this process as parents and in anger management. So, John, thank
I know we can all relate to everything you've said. Personally, I have a teenager at home, and I know it's hard to to raise them and deal with their anger and their emotions. Huh? Our first question, Rachel, is from Giovanni. He asks, how can we help our children direct their anger towards healthy outcomes?
Yeah, that's a good question. The key is to helping them understand what triggered their anger, because by understanding what got them angry and how they, and oftentimes I'll say, well, how would you like to behave when you're angry? Because oftentimes these kids, they don't like how they have remorse. They don't like their behavior. They want to change it. They don't know how to change it. It's become a habit for them to lash out or react however they're reacting. So what we can do is when they're calm, again, you cannot do this when they're angry. When they're calm, talk to them, let them know, it upsets me when I see you get that worked up about something. Let's talk about other ways that you can channel your anger. For example, you really like to do to work on the bike, or you really like to cook, or you really like to play soccer or lacrosse or whatever, basketball. So helping them figure out other alternative means. And like I mentioned with the client that I worked with, the kid was basically punching holes in the house wall. And he said, well, that's not going to do well because the parents are having to fix the property. The kid's destroying their hand. Let's get a heavy bag. And that this family had a place that they purchased a heavy bag, got some boxing gloves, and what the kid did, instead of punching the wall, they knew they had a healthy outlet that they could go into the room and punch the heavy bag. So helping them find alternatives, behaviors, or places that they can display that level of anger they need to. That's non-destructive.
Great, great. Alberto Abumor comments, he says, I can see that many of the things that trigger our children are normal things that happen in life. But it seems that younger generations react or overreact more than what we used to do or the way we reacted when we were children.
That's an excellent observation. We've got to remember this younger generation that we're dealing with. They live in a 24/7 world. What I mean is technology is fast-paced, it's evolving. Even their television shows that they're watching, they can watch straight one episode after another, where before in the past, we might have to wait through seasons, right? But they don't have that patience built into them because we are constantly feeding them through social media and technology. And we even have social media that is particularly targeting in on our children, that's keeping them where they want to keep coming back to the social media. So as parents, it is difficult because we are fighting, we are competing, I guess, in a world that is 24/7 fast paced, and that's affecting them emotionally. So that's very astute observation that was made, and I'm seeing it as well. And that's why we as educators, parents, really need to get on the forefront of helping teach our kids how to cope, because they're lacking coping skills.
Mm-hmm. Paola Nicole asks, would you recommend to use all of these tips with 5-year-olds?
You have to, the tips for calmness, consistency is huge. The earlier you start this, the less trouble you're going to have as they get older. So the key is starting it at an early age. Teaching consistency is really important when working with children. Also teaching them to use their language, teaching them to calm down. You can teach a young child to breathe. I often use, I wish I had one. We call them pinwheels, where you blow on it and it spins different colors. Often those are great for little kids to teach them to blow on it, watch the colors. It helps them calm down. But teach them how to we call it self-soothing, soothe themselves, calm down. These are absolutely skills that you can work on with a 5-year-old. And if you can hop on it at an early age, it's going to be easier for them to be able to regulate their emotions as they get older, because they're going into life with coping skills. healthy coping skills.
Okay. Javiera asks, how can we intervene when we see that our child is starting to get angry?
Mhm. Go ahead and tell them to, I see you're getting really upset right now. Why don't you go listen? If this is a teenager, for example, why don't you go listen to your music, calm down. I'll give you a few minutes and I'm going to come back and we'll talk. We'll talk through what's upsetting you. Space. Get them to come down with space, because if you try to use logic and reasoning when they're starting to get upset, it's most likely not going to work. You can also, if you feel that your kid is going to be able to talk to you, then you can say, I can see you're getting really upset right now. Why don't we process through this together? I want to help you. Tell me what's got you upset. And they may struggle with the words for what's got them upset, and they might not be able to pinpoint it. And that's where we can help guide them as parents.
Okay. Are there any books that talk about this topic in greater depth? Maybe
Yeah.
some books that you could recommend?
I have I have written, and I don't know if it's been translated into Spanish. It has been translated into other languages, but the Anger Workbook for Teens, I teach a lot of skills. There's 2 editions, and the second edition I really built from the first edition and taught a lot more of those grounding skills, the breathing, the mindfulness, the vision skills, and also teaching children not to hold on to problematic thoughts or troublesome thoughts and fight with them, but just to realize that they're a thought, nothing more, nothing less, so they don't give power to their thoughts. Because if we could change negative thinking or unhealthy thinking, we would. It's not quite so easy. But the Anger Workbook for Teens, there are some other books for younger children. I'm Not Bad, I'm Just Mad is another really good workbook that you can work through with younger children. But there are some really good resources. Stanford University puts out some really good resources for parents working with angry children. There's a famous researcher there that has done a lot of wonderful things. I also like UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley does a lot of really good research and has a great resource called The Greater Good. There's wonderful videos. They're constantly pulling in other researchers and sharing top-notch research that's out there, and that's called The Greater Good. I think it's .com if I'm not mistaken. Might be .org. greatergood.com. So there's a lot of really good resources that are out there for parents. Child Mind Institute also has a lot of wonderful resources to help understand different phases of anger.
Great, great. Juan Pablo Cabello asks, how should we react as parents when we see other children or another child who is intimidating our child?
Oh, that's a hard one. Yeah. You want to give your child autonomy and not embarrass them. So I guess I would, if you're watching it happen, we've got to model the behavior. So I would intervene if I saw, someone that was intimidating my own child, if I felt my child was in danger. You really have to assess the situation. If I felt it was something that I was just watching to see how my child was reacting, but they weren't in danger, then I would wait, give them that respect, that privacy of having that interaction, and that would be definitely something we would be talking about at home. And then I would be finding out, is this a continuing behavior? For example, is this a one-time incident, or is this a continuation? Because if we go into a continual pattern, then we're looking at something called bullying. So that's something we would want to definitely watch out for, but it would depend on the age of my child and whether or not I felt that they were in a threatening situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Javier asks, how should we react when our child comes back to us full of regret.
Oh.
Mhm.
You know at that point in time that your child has processed and felt that they behaved wrong, that they did something wrong. So sit, listen. It doesn't mean now some I've worked with kids that also do that to go back to get what they want. So you have to assess the situation. I do love working with teens. They're a challenge, but for the teen that really comes in is remorseful. Process, listen, but remember consistency. If their behavior was so out of control and that they do get the consequence of whatever you need to do as a parent, because we're still in a teaching mode as parents. So help them redirect their behaviors, listen, express your gratitude and acknowledge how proud you are that they're doing adult-like behaviors and coming and having this conversation. But unfortunately, they're not going to get to do that activity this weekend as a consequence of the way they behaved. But that's really important, and that's that consistency part that I was talking about.
Okay. Sophia Papas asks, as parents, we deal with a lot of stress ourselves. How can we calm our stress or deal with our stress in order to react appropriately to our children's anger?
We need timeouts as adults. If you are on edge, even if you scale yourself, like, okay, after work today or with everything I had to deal with, I'm like a level 8 right now on my scale. So I'm not going to be able to deal most effectively with my child. So especially with the teen, let them know I need space right now and we can talk later. But you're absolutely right. Like, one of the things that parents are reporting more burnout now, especially during the pandemic, than ever before. They're between everything that's going on and then managing all of the different things in our own lives as well as our children's. We're burning out. So we have to practice what we call self-care. I oftentimes think of whenever I get on an airplane that the flight attendant stands in front of the airplane with the oxygen mask, and the first person they say to put the oxygen mask on is you, because we're not going to be able to help others unless we take care of ourselves first. The same thing is true with parenting. We have to take care of ourselves. So if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling on edge, realize, as we're talking about teaching our kids to recognize their triggers, realize where you're at emotionally. And you're probably not going to be on your best A game to deal with your child that's going to push your buttons at that point in time. So try to find ways to relieve your stress. Go out, take a walk, do something that you enjoy doing to re-energize.
Great. David asks, how can we explain a young child about or how to acknowledge anger so that he may understand it?
Yeah, a lot of times kids do really good with pictures and drawings. So having them draw how they feel, and sometimes you're going to get a little monster, or you're going to get squiggly lines of how they're feeling. That's not uncommon. And being able to say, what does that feel like right now? Tell does it make you sad? Does it make you mad? And even showing emotions. I love emoticons, and you can go onto a web browser and type in feeling charts, and you'll get all of these faces. I actually showed you one with the scaling that was actually geared towards younger children, and it had emoticons with faces on them. So it went from a sad face all the way to a happy face. You can do that with feelings too, and it'll specifically tell feelings, and you can say, okay, look at the pictures, which picture is what you feel, and then right below it is the word, and they can point to the face, and then you can help them process that feeling. Again, those are called feeling charts, and they're made up of emoticons.
Osvaldo Refusta asks, I can see the role of psychology in dealing with anger. What is the role of psychiatry in all of this?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's why I wanted to hit some of those clinical mental health disorders that we see that are common. And one I didn't really bring up that we're beginning to see that more teens have, but is being underdiagnosed, is something called intermittent explosive disorder. It's IED. And we also see it in conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. So when we're looking from a psychopathology perspective, we see that anger is a symptom in many childhood disorders. And when we're looking at psychiatry, we also realize that we might be dealing with what we call a biopsychosocial perspective. I don't want to get too deep here, but basically looking at all these different elements from our environment to our biological makeup to our behaviors, our personality that affects our psychological well-being. And sometimes psychotropics or medications are needed when we're dealing with children that have something what I call beyond anger. Anger is just a symptom of a more present, prevailing underlying condition.
Carolina wants to know, where can she get the breathing ball?
Oh, okay. And this was an Amazon. So I Amazoned it now. I had it in my one day Amazon, but Amazon, and they're great. It's plastic. There are some that have lights on them. I steer clear of those because I did have an angry teen one time break the lights out whenever they were. So just get the regular old breathing ball. Another thing I love, and I put them here, I have my motto, inside out, because I like to help people change their lives or transform their lives from the inside out. I love rocks and people, even adults. Like if I have little rocks, they like to rub the rocks. This is a sensory type feel. So having rocks, if you have a child that needs to move around a lot, therapy putty, Amazon too. It's called therapy putty. It's great for dexterity, and it's not, it doesn't get stringy like some of the Play-Doh type putty or silly putty type stuff, but it's actually meant to help with occupational therapy and physical therapy. But it's great for anxiety, stress, worry, for that fidgeter, because it's not uncommon for me to see kids who have a lot of anger that'll pick their cuticles apart or chew on their nails. So this is a great alternative.
Isabel Allende says, bullying is something that we can see in most schools today, and that could deal or lead to a change in the behavior of our children. When can I know when to intervene and say something about it?
With an adolescent, I would definitely be having conversations with my adolescent, but also with bullying, that can really affect and scar kids. And sometimes they need us to intervene, even if they're telling us not to intervene. So if you suspect that your child is being harmed and bullied, and here's the key thing, bullying, kind of like we talked about how technology has changed, bullying has changed. We actually call it two different things. Traditional bullying is back when they went to school or were on the playground and they were getting teased and taunted and bullying. But now we have something called cyberbullying that's occurring. So bullying, it doesn't just stop whenever they get out of school. It can occur 24/7 with social media. So as parents, and we might not be aware of it, our kids might not be sharing that with us. So as parents, we have to be an advocate for our child. So whether it's speaking with a school counselor, an educator, a principal to help advocate for our child. Most educators have been trained on the concept of bullying. The very last thing that anyone should do is bring what we call the perpetrator, the child that is doing the bullying. And I'm not a fan of calling children bullies. I know sometimes people call them bullies. That's labeling a child. And I would rather look at the behavior and separate the behavior from the child. So the child who does the bullying should not be brought into the same room with the child who is being bullied. because bullying is about a power differential that's occurring. And whenever that is done and you're trying to do that, is not a conflict resolution scene when you're dealing with bullying. So, you can talk to educators privately, let them know what's happening, advocate for your child, and help your child to develop skills and feel empowered so that they can trust you and come to you. See, that's the key with teens. They've got to trust us as parents or they won't share anything with us.
Okay. Yvonne asks, how can we handle academic demands so that they do not, or at least just cause little stress?
Yeah. Oftentimes our youth lack time management, and I'll be honest, I I struggle with that in my own household with my adolescent who is taking some college courses in high school. It's just this demand, this rigor that they're doing, and the pressure. And again, they don't have the coping skills to be able to learn those time management. So it really falls on the educators. And I'm an educator too. It falls on me to make sure that I'm teaching the youth that I work with how to manage time. Also, to teach them how to prioritize and balance things, because sometimes there may be a lot coming at them at once and they don't need to do it all. These are for my overachievers, that perfectionistic child who wants to get all high marks, who has this unrealistic expectation that they're going to be perfect in everything. I wrote a blog one time called Perfectly Imperfect, because I think that really zeroes in on that perfectionistic behavior, but we're teaching them to balance and prioritize.
Okay. Hyun asks, how can cartoons or video games with violence or violent content influence our children?
Well, there has been a lot of studies that there's been mixtures of studies, to be honest with you. Some that show that it does have a detrimental impact. That's particularly so for younger children. So it's really important at a young age that we monitor what our children are doing online, because it's going to be harder to do that when they become adolescents. For example, I had an adolescent who had their phone taken away, and they said, "That's okay. I just go to school and I get my friend's phone." And then they're still communicating, even though the parent thinks they've taken the phone away. So as they get older, they figure out the system a little bit better. So it's really important young to set those boundaries. There's actually been studies that have shown that adolescents want us as parents to put parameters on how much social media they use. They don't want to have all that free time, even though they may say that. They really want us to intervene. And I'm a strong advocate of taking the device away at night while they're sleeping so they're not up, because they can lose track of time very easy playing games, watching streaming television shows, and then it's 2 o'clock in the morning and their alarm clock's going off at 6 o'clock, and they're not going to be able to function at school the next day. So we need to set the rules early in the game to help our kids. And with the violence and the gaming, as they get older, it's harder to monitor that. When they're younger, we really need to do a good job of teaching boundaries and not letting them be exposed to those violent things. Because if they're online, the advertisements, the pop-ups, the cookies that are going to be created, that's what's going to keep popping up every time they go online. And then they're going to hop onto the new game and they're going to be on to the next best thing. And that's where we have to protect them, because the social media industry is not going to protect them. They're going to advertise to them.
That's right. That's right. Before we continue, Rachel, Danielle, we have about 15 more questions. Do we have time to go through all of them, or do we have a time limit here?
Yo creo que podemos destinar 10 minutos
I
más.
think that we can still have maybe 10 more minutes, maybe make shorter answers so everyone can have their answers. So maybe that's my proposal. Try to shorten the answers, maybe be more
Okay, so
specific.
we'll continue for 10 more minutes, okay? Uh, Alfredo Tagle asks, what can you tell us about children regulating themselves, especially when they're playing amongst themselves? Uh, is this true? Do they regulate themselves better when they are playing with other children? Is it easier for them to become angry when they're in the intimacy of their homes? What can you say about that?
We let our guard down more. We can be more of ourselves when we're at our home than when we're around other people. When playing with other children, they do use other children as role models. So they're watching what their peers are doing and modeling those behaviors with their peers. So they can absolutely learn those regulation skills with peers, but let their guard down when they're at home.
Okay. Daniela Abumor says, if I try to do what you have taught us, should the anger episodes diminish?
That's going to be up to your child is ultimately in control of his or her own behavior. But these are fundamental things that we know through the research, through the evidence that are effective skills to utilize when working with angry youth.
Okay. Andrea Caviedes, she says, as educators, how can we develop resilience in our children and our young teenagers?
Yeah, resilience, that's a whole nother topic right there. That is our ability to bounce back in the face of adversity and really teaching kids to practice that self-care whenever something's bothering them and being able to teach them that they have the skills to overcome life's obstacles is really important. That really is a whole other set of skills when we're dealing with resilience.
Andrea also asks, are there any educational theories that could help us deal with these anger explosions?
Yeah, one of the theories I rely a lot on is something called social information processing theory. Um, it's by Dr. Crick and Dr. Dodge. There's been a lot of research on it, and particularly in the form of aggression. So that's a really good theory that you can draw from. I also, as an educator, I use a lot of Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory in understanding child behavior. So just going back to that social cognitive, and then most of my research has been developed around a theory called relational frame theory, which is a third way behavioral theory that helps us understand the processing of our thoughts and feelings. And acceptance commitment therapy was drawn from relational frame theory. So there's three.
Great, great. And I think this is our last question. Soledad asks, what can I do to avoid being caught in the anger spiral of my child?
Remove yourself from it. Let them know that, they're not behaving in a way that is appropriate and that you're going to give them some space. You're going to take some space. And then when everybody's calmed down, that you'll address the matter. Again, you're not going to rationalize with an angry person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And Maria Eugenia asks if we can send the list of books that you mentioned. Daniel, maybe you can do that, or this is being recorded, so they can go through it again.
Sí. Exactamente, eso es lo que
Exactly. That's what we were going to say. This recording, this talk is going to be on the cloud. We're going to give you the link tomorrow, and you can review each of the references and the books that Rachel mentioned. So now I have to thank Carlos for the introduction. Thank you for introducing Rachel. Thank you for that extraordinary presentation. Thank you, the audience. for the question. Thank you, John, for including everyone who asked question and everyone in the audience. Thank you so much. Thank you once more for all of this. This has been amazing. This gives us the power and the tools to be better parents. So, Rachel, thank you very much. I saw that you wrote muchas gracias in Spanish in your presentation. Thank you for sharing with us. We appreciate that. Thank you, John. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, everyone who made this possible. And we will see you again soon. I see a lot of messages on the chat, everyone appreciating this instance. And we are going to keep going with neuroscience the first week of November. See you then and have a great afternoon or a great evening, depending where you are. Have a great day. Thank you.
Ok,